Throughout the process of creating the original Star Wars films, George Lucas had intended for multiple sequels to take place afterwards. In fact, most of the production of Episode 5 was done under the presumption that it was the middle chapter of a 9-part story arc. However, Lucas decided to close off the lingering story threads in Episode 6, thus not committing himself into doing more than just the prequels, which he had developed enough to be fascinated by. However, by the time Episode 1 was released, Lucas had been stating in interviews for a few years that there was to be no sequel trilogy, and by 2005 he seemed to close the door pretty succinctly on more films. In spite of this, he began to change his mind sometime during the late 2000s, early 2010s. This was in part motivated by the desire to retire, and he knew that if the company was placed in another's hands, they would want to create more films. While working on the attraction Star Tours 2 for the Disney company, CEO Bob Iger met with Lucas privately to discuss the possibility of buying Lucasfilm and its assets. Lucas wasn't quite ready to do that yet, but the offer remained in the back of his mind. Soon after, Lucas began some outlines for the next trilogy, and personally reached out to Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford about reprising their characters. We don't know everything that was in those outlines, but we do know some of it, such as Luke exiling himself and becoming a hermit, the return of the Sith, with one source specifically mentioning Darth Maul's reemergence, a female Padawan of Luke's, Leia being the true chosen one, and there would have been a large focus on the Wills, who control the universe and feed off of the Force. Disney purchased the company in October 2012, and Lucas was kept on for a few early story meetings. However, Disney decided to discard Lucas's story treatments and went on to develop their own ideas. The original writer hired was Michael Arndt, who turned in a complete draft, but who also departed because he required more time than Disney or Lucasfilm were willing to give him to polish it. The script was then turned over to Lawrence Kasdan and the newly announced director, J.J. Abrams. Abrams was one of a number of contenders for the job, and he actually declined the offer at first, having already done other sequel films. However, Steven Spielberg, Kathleen Kennedy, and Kasdan all worked on him to get him to change his mind. The film was given about 3 years to be developed before its release, the same time frame as many of the previous films, and work began almost immediately after the Disney sale. Some of the production crew was sourced from the previous films, like John Williams for the music. Some had worked with Abrams before, like cinematographer Dan Mindel, and others were new faces. The cast was quite eclectic as well. Beyond the returning players, you had respected veteran actors like Andy Serkis and Max von Sydow, exciting contemporary faces like Oscar Isaac, Adam Driver, and Lupita Nyong'o, and relative newcomers like John Boyega and Daisy Ridley. The mandate in all departments was to harken back to the original trilogy, such as shooting the movie on physical film, using practical creatures whenever possible, making the ships and planets extensions of what had been seen 30 years before, and with even the story of the film deliberately echoing the past. Star Wars films have usually been surrounded with a massive level of hype, and The Force Awakens was no exception. We were given a teaser trailer a full year before the film's release, and each subsequent trailer told us little about the upcoming story. Fans were quick to assemble guidelines for what they felt the new films had to do to avoid the perceived pitfalls of the previous trilogy, and a lot of the information we were getting seemed to be in line with those broad strokes. While this was to be principally the start of a new trilogy, everybody knew The Force Awakens was also, in reality, a testbed for Disney and Lucasfilm to establish themselves and their take on the property before branching off into subsequent spin-off films and TV shows. And given the success of Disney's work with the Marvel Cinematic Universe at the time, expectations were understandably high for Episode 7. The Force Awakens was released to the world on December 18, 2015, and initially received largely positive reviews from both fans and critics, even going so far as the film being included on AFI's Top 10 of 2015 list. The film also did extremely well at the box office, becoming both the third film ever to gross more than $2 billion worldwide and the highest grossing in the United States and Canada, inflation unadjusted. Now more than 10 years later, this film's reputation is decidedly mixed, especially in the wake of the subsequent episodes and streaming shows. The entire sequel trilogy has become subject to the same kind of derision that the prequels initially went through as well, with a large crowd voicing their strong negative opinions online. Time will tell if the sequels will continue to carry this reputation with future fans, or if it will be largely relegated to the dustbins of history. 30 years after the fall of the Empire, evil re-emerges from its ashes. The First Order has risen to take its place, and due to the complacency of the New Republic, it has been allowed to grow to the point of challenging the balance of power. Luke Skywalker has also seemingly vanished, along with his new Jedi Order. In an effort to find him, Leia sends Resistance pilot Poe Dameron to Jakku after a map, which is said to reveal where Luke is gone. Led by Kylo Ren, the First Order catches up to Poe and captures him, but not before Poe entrusts the map to his droid BB-8 and sends him away. Poe is rescued by a turncoat stormtrooper FN-2187, who assumes the name Finn. However, during their escape, they crash land back on Jakku and are separated. Meanwhile, BB-8 finds a young scavenger named Rey, who agrees to watch over him. Spotting Finn in a crowd wearing Poe's jacket, BB-8 and Rey confront Finn, who convinces them he is a Resistance fighter who can get them back to their secret base. On the run from the First Order, they escape in a derelict ship, hoping to return the map to Leia and restore hope to the galaxy. Certain films can be intimidating to review, partly due to the overwhelming amount of previous reviews and press coverage surrounding them. But I haven't let that stop me from reviewing the other Star Wars films. But when a film is accompanied by a strong emotional response and has been extensively analyzed, sometimes in multiple hours-long reviews from the same channel detailing every one of its successes and failures, it can be downright daunting. Imagine if you actually have an opinion that goes against the norm. It can be like standing in front of a mob and saying, well, actually, and then becoming their new target of ire. The Star Wars sequel trilogy is a notable sore spot for a lot of fans. I've seen backlash resembling this before, but it does seem like every time I go online, even if it's for nothing related to pop culture, if I stay on long enough, someone somewhere feels the need to crap on the trilogy. On the one hand, I find this behavior quite alarming and disheartening. There are a lot of films I think are far worse than any theatrical Star Wars films, some of which have had similar large budgets and prevalence in the public eye. But the sequels are becoming a peculiar anomaly with their constant, almost obsessive-like, venomous scrutiny online that I'm becoming tired of the franchise, not so much because of the varying quality of the subsequent projects, but more due to its overexposure in the online discussion. On the other hand, this does not need to be a war. The fandom is not a monolith, nor does it only have two sides. These views come from a variety of different people, many of whom are innocently expressing their opinions, which we all have, and it's not all negative. Most importantly, it's not like the dissenting side doesn't have a point and that they're all raging misogynistic egomaniacs who can't handle a girl protagonist in films. Many that I've talked to are reasonable, well-meaning people who are just voicing their thoughts. I think each of the sequel films has notable problems, with some of Episode 9's being large enough to damage itself, the trilogy, and the saga as a whole. And I can totally understand the negativity if the sequels ruined your interest in a series you used to love, thus magnifying your disappointment above other bad films which are probably worse. But by and large, I'm not particularly incensed by their presence, and both Episodes 7 and 8 are frequent rewatches for me and my family. Now, this video expresses my subjective views on the film, just like every other review I've done, so don't expect to find objective truth that we can all agree on. I'm not looking to convince anybody. I'm certainly not going to have time to address every single bit of criticism made by others, though I will talk about a few of the major ones and where I stand on those issues. And feel free to continue the discourse in the comments. Please be civil about it, though. Avoid the obvious toxic pitfalls of name-calling, overgeneralization, stirring the pot, needing to win the argument at all costs, and the like. There's enough constant negativity surrounding this franchise and entertainment as a whole. This video is just my explanation of why I like the film, and if you find it lacking, so be it. To me, The Force Awakens is a very effective film. It's fun, fast-paced, has some good performances, visuals, and ideas, and leaves me in a happy mood. Does it rely too much on past ideas and formulas? Absolutely, sometimes to a fault. Does it gloss over things I wish we had a better explanation for or that we spent more time with? Also yes. But if a film can be nearly as entertaining to me 10 years later as it was the first time out despite these problems, it's doing something right. Each of our new main players distinctly echoes past characters, but also feature enough differences that I can't really call them carbon copies. Let's begin with Rey. Rey fits the traditional hero mold, just as Luke Skywalker did, and she shares a number of similarities to Luke and some with Anakin. She loves to tinker with machines, she's a half-decent pilot, she's lived most of her life on a desert planet, she has a deep, untested connection to the Force that she initially resists, and as we'll learn later, she has a powerful family legacy that she's unaware of. But there are important distinctions between her and Luke. Luke had an uncle and an aunt, with a reclusive, loving mentor watching over him. Rey has no one who really cares about her and is left to her own devices to survive. Luke was a moisture farmer, helping to bring about life. Rey is a scavenger, finding usefulness in the discarded garbage left by others. Luke had ambitions of going off and joining the academy. Rey's greatest desire is to belong to a family, though she too would love to have adventures. When Luke was offered the call to adventure, he rejected it primarily out of a working obligation to his family and a sense that he couldn't really make a difference. Rey rejects it because she loves and wants to be there for her family, but also out of fear of her own power and what she could become. Luke was told fiction about his heritage, which kept his expectations in check, until Obi-Wan told him a half-truth to inspire him. Rey created a fiction to give herself hope, which turns out to be partly true, but with contextual nuance that she never imagined. These similarities and differences will be further explored in the next two films, and there are more. But right away, I felt a lot of sympathy for Rey, and while she was obviously in a similar position to Luke in this story, I felt there was room to work with and allow her to go on a different path towards the same ultimate goal. Her introduction, primarily accompanied by John Williams' fantastic theme, gave me everything I needed to know about her largely through visual storytelling, and I feel this is one of the film's best scenes. Her growth in this film is pretty substantial, and it showcases the power of belief. Belief's opposites, doubt and fear, are the plagues that rob us of our will to act. In other words, faith is the necessary first step to action. Through most of the film, Rey will not allow herself to move on in life because she's chosen to stay in the rut. She's looking to the past for belonging and will not trade the hope of her family coming back for something that could potentially be better. Add to that, we'll learn in the later films that she's always felt the Force within her. She's afraid of that power and the sacrifices that come with its emergence, and she will do nothing to awaken it. She has no confidence in herself and her ability to adapt and survive off of Jakku, which is ironic given her life as a desert scavenger. Her opportunity for change is foreshadowed when Maz tells her to let it in. Maz knows the Force and understands that surrendering yourself to its will is perhaps the most important action a Jedi can do. She rejects it at first, but I completely understand and sympathize with Rey's choice here. She's had her first transcendent experience with the Force, and it's unlike anything she's ever experienced. She gets a taste of her future power, and she's afraid to let it in because of the baggage, the continued growth and responsibilities that come with it. Her time with Kylo Ren, both in the interrogation cell and in the final fight, teaches her that this is not something that she can escape. Now that her existence is known in the galaxy and the Force has awakened within her, evil will not rest until they have her in their grasp. Hiding and inaction is not an option. She must embrace her power. And she succeeds just enough to defeat Kylo Ren and get off the planet. But she knows she'll need guidance. So she is sent off to find Luke, one of the only people left who can give her that training. She hasn't got it all figured out yet, but she's well on her way. Daisy Ridley brings a believable vulnerability to Rey, and I was personally quite impressed with her. I think her best performance is yet to come, but I felt at the time she could grow into one of our great working actresses with some more work under her belt. Before we move on to other characters, let's talk about some of the major criticisms of Rey, namely her being a Mary Sue and her incredible power growth. In case you're unfamiliar with the term, a Mary Sue is a character, usually a female, that has no flaws and encounters no obstacles for growth. It's a bit of a spin on the competent man trope, who is a polymath who has a wide range of knowledge and abilities, and is an archetype that plagues a lot of older science fiction and adventure stories. The problem is if your character is unbelievably capable in a story that supposedly contains a character arc for them, it destroys all tension in that story. It's a pretty sophomoric writing mistake. As far as I can tell, the conversation surrounding Rey being a Mary Sue can be traced back to or was propelled by a series of tweets from Max Landis, the son of noted director John Landis and who is also a screenwriter. I can kind of see where he's coming from, though it's hard for me not to be somewhat dismissive of his arguments, given that he's spouted some pretty misogynistic comments and has been accused of sexual assault from multiple people. So it's not exactly like I trust him to be an advocate for women. There are indications of this trope within the films themselves, particularly with Rey knowing the Shiruk language despite coming from a remote desert planet, taking out 3 ships with one shot in Episode 8, and piloting a water speeder in Episode 9. But ultimately, I'm just not buying the argument that she has no flaws and makes no mistakes. Her fear in her power, her insistence on looking for external validation and defining her existence by the actions of her predecessors are pretty major stumbling blocks that accompany her throughout the trilogy. As the next film suggests, she did beat Kylo Ren, but only by drawing heavily on the Force and because Ren was wounded and unbalanced after killing his father. In fact, Ren very nearly wins their next real confrontation in Episode 9 after she has had some training and is only bested by being momentarily distracted. And as far as her being an excellent pilot, she knocks the ship into nearly everything in her takeoff, and it's Finn who destroys the TIE fighters. It's not exactly the same as someone like Han, who ran the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs and flew through an asteroid field, or Anakin with his poetry in starfighter combat, or Poe with his graceful maneuverability in an X-Wing. And we do know that Rey has had some previous flight training before, as well as some familiarity with the Falcon and older ships' technology. So what we see her do here doesn't seem to stretch the realms of belief to me. But let's be honest, the center of this argument has to do with her rapid progression in the Force with no training. Unfortunately, Star Wars has always been pretty murky with how much training is needed to pull off certain feats. The old expanded universe, particularly the video games, has example after example of neophytes pulling off extraordinary feats with little to no training, like young Galen Merrick pulling the lightsaber from Darth Vader's hand, Kyle Katarn just learning Force powers without training in multiple games, Jaden Korr building a lightsaber all their own before joining the Academy, or all of Luke's new apprentices overcoming the powerful Exar Kun's spirit. Even in the film's new canon, it can be vague. For example, Anakin pilots a pod racer at 9 years old and wins the Boonta Eve, despite never winning a race before and claiming he's the only human who can do it, and then subsequently destroying the droid control ship. Or how about the unnamed smuggler in Vader Immortal that can hold his own against Darth Vader in his prime just hours after picking up a lightsaber? The only feats I can see Rey pull off that require some Force ability are the mind trick, the Force pull of the saber, and defeating Kylo Ren. The mind battle between Kylo and Rey could explain how she picks up the first two, as she turns the tables on him and begins to read his mind. Who knows what else she's learned from him beyond his fears? Plus, she tries 3 times before the mind trick works, so it's not like she's instantly a master of the Force. And defeating Kylo Ren can easily be explained away, as I said earlier. Finally, films are condensed tales that don't always follow realistic progressions anyways, so power growths are commonly sped up in a lot of films. With Star Wars being a fantasy where the rules are hardly explained, these acts seem small enough given the feats we've seen in the other films that they hardly seem like the worst culprits of this series' persistent problem of rapid power growths. Even Yoda tells Luke that moving stones and lifting X-Wings are no different to each other except in his mind. If Rey was pulling down Star Destroyers or moving planets on her first day of exploring her Force powers, that would be a problem. Though according to Yoda's logic, you could indeed do that if you are strong-minded and disciplined enough. But a Jedi mind trick and overpowering an injured Sith wannabe who just murdered his father, had his soul split by the act, and who is not trying to kill you? I can buy that. So for now, I'm not buying the argument that Rey is a Mary Sue, though we will readdress this question with the next two films' reviews. One of the film's themes is the duality of good and evil. Rey represents the good, while Kylo represents the bad. As much as this is Rey's story, I could almost make the argument that this story is as much about Kylo Ren. He represents the wayward soul, doubling down on his sinful ways as he feels ill-suited in the light, despite its beckoning. He felt burdened by the lofty expectations of his family, as well as having a strained relationship with his parents. Due to their responsibilities and personal natures, Han and Leia were not equipped to raise the boy with the proper care, and thus he was sent off to live with his uncle. We learn in the next film how that relationship fell apart, but we're given enough to understand that he too is looking for a place of belonging, just like Rey, and that his family didn't provide him what he was looking for. Snoke seemed to be the only one interested in him and his potential and giving him an avenue to explore his talents at his own pace, and he took it. It's the idea from Milton that it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It's a universal story that we've seen before, but that's a lot of what made the series work in the first place. Old stories done anew and executed to great effect. Out of all of the actors in this trilogy, I feel Adam Driver gets the least amount of grief, with some even going so far as to claim he is what makes this trilogy watchable. Obviously, I don't share that belief. But Driver is a spectacular actor, and he absolutely owns this role right from the start, bringing the necessary insecurity to someone trying to live up to a powerful manufactured expectation of a ghost from the past. It's great stuff. John Boyega's Finn also does a lot to elevate the movie. I'll talk more about where his arc goes in the subsequent reviews, but this is a fine start, and he's probably the most original of the characters. A soldier bred for war from birth who rejects it at his first encounter. He shows us that humanity cannot be fully snuffed out or trained out of people. There's a spark of hope and light within us all, even in those who were created and trained to fight for evil. It does start from a place of fear with Finn, but we all have to start somewhere, right? I feel a lot of people have misinterpreted his arc in this film and claim The Last Jedi just regressed him to the same place he was at the start of these events. I disagree. I don't think he learns to fight for a cause larger than himself through these events. Rather, he starts to bond with others, namely Rey and Poe. They both treat him as an actual person versus an automaton, so he sticks his neck out for them, not the Resistance. Remember that he only goes to Starkiller Base to get Rey, and he helps out only insofar as it helps him accomplish his goal of saving Rey and Poe, and by extension, the Resistance. I don't believe he really cares about fighting the First Order or the Resistance cause by the end here, but I'm okay with where he ends up. The Force Awakens is part one of a story, so it's natural he has more left to learn. Poe is the least explored of the main trio, and that's in part because he was supposed to die towards the beginning. When being interviewed for the role, Oscar Isaac was excited about the character, but requested that he live, as he had just done a number of movies where he died in the first act. I do think this is the first major evidence we see that these films' overarching plan, if there ever was a plan from the beginning, was far more thinly drawn than it should have been or was dropped when encountering the first sign of resistance. Poe is considered one of the main trio now, but if Oscar had not pushed back, there might have been just a duo, which would have substantially changed the next two films. For now, I like that his sense of humor is quite different to every other character we've seen in the series, though I do sympathize with folks that feel it's too modern and doesn't jive with this universe's style. It does go further than I would like, but I also like that while he's kind of a stand-in for Han, his brashness and cocky demeanor takes on a different flavor. I do think he's too underutilized in this film, and I would have liked to have had more time with him if he was going to be part of the main cast moving forward. The other new characters are a bit of a mixed bag, verging on being disappointing. Domhnall Gleeson is a solid performer that I've loved in plenty of other projects, and I love Hux' dynamic with Kylo. He serves a similar function to Tarkin, being the face of the military side of things, but I love how he and Kylo butt heads against each other versus working with each other. It creates a fresh take on the bad guys here. However, I don't think he's nearly as memorable as Tarkin, and I think his reduced screen presence is because he's a casualty of the overstuffed cast. Speaking of which, I've never cared for Captain Phasma. This has nothing to do with Gwendoline Christie as an actor, but I think the push to get her unique character design in the film was misjudged. She doesn't really serve a point in this or the next film that couldn't have been given to Hux or Kylo. And if the creators were in love with the design so much, they should have waited for another film or project to use her where she might have made more of an impact. George Lucas was also guilty of shoving in characters just because their design was cool, but he did try to make them have a point, and he was always willing to drop an idea if he felt it could be better served elsewhere. This is one case where I think the filmmakers should have followed George's playbook. Same goes for Snoke. I really don't mind not knowing much about him right out the gate, but I think he should have been saved for at least one movie. Have him hinted at and talked about, let his presence be built up, and wait until film 2 to bring him out. Andy Serkis's talent as an actor needs no elaboration, and I think Snoke had the potential to be a unique kind of bad guy for the series. But again, I think the film has too many characters to serve and he got lost in the shuffle. BB-8 is a fun presence and has enough personality that I don't feel the need for a droid duo like we've had before. He's probably the most iconic new character from the film, and I think it's the Groot effect. Cuteness and comedy go a long way to cement a character in someone's mind. Maz Kanata is also a fun addition, and I like that she's a connection to other aspects of the Star Wars universe beyond war, namely both the underworld element and the spiritual side of things, at least until Luke comes in. She's not really a mentor, she's more the connecting tissue contact. Too bad she goes nowhere in the next 2 films. And speaking of other wasted actors, poor Max. He gets cast in 2 of my favorite franchises, gets a brief role in each, and then we never see him again. At least in Never Say Never Again, he was in more of the film. This guy was a phenomenal talent, and he kept getting bit parts that didn't show him off. Dang it! There are a rather large number of cameos in the film, and I most enjoy Simon Pegg as Unkar Plutt and Daniel Craig as the interrogation room stormtrooper. As much as this is a story primarily centered around our new characters, the legacy characters, if included, should still play an important part. Han Solo was a good choice for this first film to focus on, principally because of the role reversal of a rogue being a mentor and a guide to our heroes. He was initially the skeptic in all this, so him confirming the Jedi and Force's existence to Rey and Finn is a touching moment. This is what I feel Harrison Ford wanted for Han in Return of the Jedi, a story purpose that Han could uniquely serve and bring something more to the film, which I feel he definitely does here. Yeah, it's similar to Ben Kenobi in an outline form, but the through line and color of Han's personality makes this fun to watch. Ford is an actor who I feel has been relying too much on his gruff and grumpy acting style for the last few decades, but this is one of the times I feel he moves furthest away from that. He's plainly a character filled with regret, but he's also having fun. He contributes to the comedy, and some of the warmest moments of the film come from him. His scenes with Rey and Leia in particular are some of my favorites, with his final scene with Kylo being a fine bit of character acting from them both. And his death is something that hit me so hard. I had trouble watching that moment on repeat viewings for some time. Here's where you can all laugh at me. The death's foreshadowing is painfully obvious, but here's the kicker. I was so wrapped up in the opening night experience and seeing the film for the first time out that I wasn't thinking ahead of the film, so I may have been the only adult on the planet who was surprised by the death. It's silly, I know, and I should be more ashamed about admitting that, but you should have seen my face that night. Leia is given a backseat here, but I was intrigued about where her relationship with Han ended up and how each coped with Ben's betrayal. I'm a big fan of the old expanded universe and Legends material, but I always thought the relationship between Han and Leia could have easily gone another way. There's no reason why a relationship between an independent rebel leader and a fly-by-the-seat-of-his-pants rebel without a cause that blossomed out of a passionate bickering had to deliver a lasting marriage. It is a hopeful prospect that the two would grow stronger over several tragedies, including the death of 2 of their sons there, and that's probably the direction I would have gone with if handed this assignment, but it's an equally understandable reaction to be torn apart by a child's betrayal. Since they felt they couldn't remain together, they went back to doing the only thing they felt comfortable doing before they met each other. But part of this trilogy's message is that running away from your failures and responsibilities is the wrong lesson. Both Han and Luke get a chance to make amends for their desertion before their death. And I imagine Leia would have gotten something just as fleshed out too had Carrie Fisher lived to do the final film, which was supposed to feature her prominently. Leia sees her failure as deserting Ben rather than leading the Resistance, and Episode 9 does have her play a part in returning Ben to the light, so she does correct her error, even if it's in a very vague, distant way. Luke's absence in the film is a fine choice to me. The original screenwriter, Michael Arndt, pointed out the potential problem with Luke. The second he enters the movie, he takes over. And if you do it at the wrong time, you're in danger of losing interest in our new characters. If Han, Luke, and Leia were all together, it would have overshadowed everything else and the audience would just want more of them, which is not ideal for a film that wants to introduce a new generation of heroes. Which is why, as blasphemous as it sounds, I don't regret not seeing the three together one final time at the expense of the moment. This is supposed to be Rey's and Finn's and Kylo's story, and using each of the films to highlight one of the original trio is a fine compromise to me. Add to that, I think it's very believable that some of our heroes might have been robbed of their chance to say goodbye to each other. Given that Luke was a recluse and Han dies at the end, there was no good way to have the three reunite in the here and now without completely rewriting the story, which I know some fans would have preferred. It could have been done as a flashback, but I like this film's focus on current events without going into a lengthy flashback, which is very much keeping in line with Lucas's style of storytelling. In this story, Luke serves better as the object of desire than ever showing up before that spectacular final coda. It gives the film a sense of mystery. It allows for the quest not to be for a way to destroy the super weapon, but rather to find the Jedi, thus bringing hope to the galaxy in a different way than in Episode 4. And it serves as a potential light at the end of the tunnel for Rey's quest, thus being a connecting bridge propelling her into her character journey for Film 2. Each of our past heroes blamed themselves for Ben's betrayal, and Luke went into the furthest kind of self-imposed exile. I'll put my cards on the table now. I adore the direction Luke goes in the next film, and I actually consider it to be one of the boldest and smartest choices this trilogy made, though I'll explain why when we get there. Chewie still plays the same role as before, but he's always played it fine, and I actually grew to like him more after this trilogy. His rage after Han's death is one of the most satisfying bits of the film to me. 3PO gets next to nothing to do, and is yet another casualty of the overstuffed cast here. And finally, R2's role here is one of my least favorite parts of the film. I know what the film is doing with his sudden reboot. We do need a sense of hope after the death of Han, and it doesn't feel right to end the film on such a sour note. But I'm sorry. His just magically returning to power at the right time is ridiculous. Maybe it would have been better for him to have had a slow start to return during the final fight, perhaps do a cutaway scene where we see some lights flicker, so that the timing doesn't seem so serendipitous. Or to have him just strolling around the base anyways, and he refuses to share that he has the rest of the map until he meets up with BB-8 who has the missing part. Since R2 doesn't want to make himself a target for the First Order before the Resistance can get to Luke, it would make sense for him to keep that information close to his chest plates. But those are just my suggestions, and hindsight is 20/20. The film has several themes surrounding it, principally the cycle of history, the duality of good and evil, and the need to face your responsibilities head-on. I've already addressed the last two, and I've been saving the cyclical history point until now because it seems to be the biggest source of contention about this film, and that's because there are two related fronts of this problem. First, this film has so much in common with Episode 4 that it can be viewed as a safe but bland remake. And second, by essentially placing the galaxy in a second civil war with the remnants of both the Empire and the Rebellion, it can feel like uninspired repetition. The trilogy both resembles and carries so many story beats from the original trilogy that it lacks a unique feel of its own, a problem the prequels did not suffer from. And the story can only really end with the triumph of good at the end, so we knew The Rise of Skywalker was going to essentially repeat bits of Return of the Jedi. I think the safe but bland remake point is a fair argument, and everyone's mileage is going to vary on that. For my money, I would have preferred something more unique starting out, but at the same time, I don't mind the direction of echoing the past on principle. As I've hopefully made clear, a lot of the characters and plot points in my eyes are done with enough differences, and since a major theme of the film is comparing and contrasting the echoes of the past, I accept it for the most part. Being a big James Bond fan, it would be hypocritical to praise and focus my channel on that series, where a number of the films are thinly veiled remakes of what came before, while also going hard on the repetition here. As I mentioned in my Return of the Jedi review, Star Wars has had a long history of repeating the original trilogy going back to at least Episode 6, which continued through the prequels and was fairly pervasive in both the expanded universe and new canon projects. I try to judge the repeats on a case-by-case basis, as there are films I like that do a fair amount of blatant repeats, like Terminator 2, Avengers Endgame, Days of Future Past, and the Back to the Future sequels. And I've seen people defending other sequels I'm more mixed about that are essentially copies of their original film, like Home Alone 2 and Die Hard 2. You could argue that The Force Awakens is worse because it's not really doing anything more than copying, but I respectfully disagree. I think it's about how history repeats itself, and I feel there are enough differences to make doing the hero's journey story again palatable. There are several repeats that I really don't like. First, Jakku. I am so sick of desert planets in Star Wars. Tatooine has been used as a crutch in many Star Wars stories. It appears in 5 of the previous 6 episodes, and after Geonosis in Episode 2, I was ready to move on from this type of biosphere. The point of Jakku is that it needs to be a wasteland with a lot of scrap lying around. Okay, fine. But there are other planets that do this idea that aren't deserts. Ord Mantell for one. Nal Hutta is another. I've seen some depictions of Felucia that match this description. Jedi Fallen Order features Braca, which is pretty close to the original concept art for Jakku. If nothing else, just do something else for the sake of visual variety. Second, Maz's castle. It's too close to the cantina for comfort. It's the same idea of a watering hole filled with a kaleidoscope of creatures from a bunch of different worlds and meant to expand the universe a bit. Except A, Rey and Finn have already met a variety of creatures before this, with Nema Outpost on Jakku being a rundown spaceport, so none of this should be eye-opening for her. B, you've already had your eye-opening moment for Rey when she first arrived on Takodana, seeing the vegetation and breathing in the life of the planet, which is more appropriate for her character. And C, there are any number of establishments you could have had Maz run that invoke the Cantina's imagery that aren't exactly the same thing, like a casino, which we do in the next film, or a gambling den. Just doing another hangout spot where the bar is the main focus feels like a lazy choice. Third, I like the final aerial battle a lot, and its staging of the action feels like a good step towards the engaging combat we get in Rogue One. But going down a trench was one step too far for me. I don't even get it. It's not a pathway into the oscillator, so why are there turrets around it? For that matter, why is it just big enough for X-Wings and TIE Fighters? Circling back to the second prong of the cyclical history point, it didn't bother me even then during my initial viewings to see the galaxy back fighting an extension of the Galactic Civil War. There's plenty of real-world history confirming how history repeats itself, a lot of times with the same players as before. And while I too was curious about how we went from the beginnings with the New Republic to where we are in Episode 7, I was confident there would be plenty of stories later that would explain all of this. And now there are. The Bad Batch, The Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and a lot of comics and books have been doing some of the legwork to get us from Episode 6 to Episode 7. In case you're curious, I find those stories are just as interesting as the progression of the New Republic was in the expanded universe, though I feel like we should be further along with developing that era than we currently are. But then again, we had the whole High Republic experiment, a lot of the comics chronicled the original trilogy era first, most of the post-Episode 6 material is far closer on the timeline to Return than Awakens, and I feel like some of the backlash towards the sequels is responsible for a lot of this focus. And we cannot seem to stop doing shows and films in between Episodes 3 and 4. Help us out, Starfighter. To be fair, I see a lot of people not pointing to the repeated visuals and ideas of the war as so much the problem, but rather how it undoes the triumphs of our heroes. The New Republic is destroyed. The Empire reemerges under a new name. None of our original trio had a happy ending, and Anakin's final act to destroy the Sith is pointless since the Sith come back anyways. I can get behind this point, especially since the original trilogy was an updated fairy tale anyways, and the ending of Episode 6 indicated that this was the beginning of happily ever after. However, there are compelling stories that show that not all victories are permanent and that our heroes might not always remain stalwart, so I'm open to this direction. Dune Messiah is a good example of this, which shows an inversion of Paul Atreides' journey from the first book. Frank Herbert once described the Dune saga as being like a fugue, which takes a musical theme and explores its variations and permutations, sometimes by inverting it. While the expanded universe made the decision to keep the New Republic and New Jedi Order intact, I think having both fail on their first go can be an equally valid road to take. Keep in mind, the New Republic was built from battered combatants and disenfranchised former senators, some of which came from the Imperial side, and it's plausible that they may have been responsible for the stagnation and apathy that the New Republic fell into, which, if you read the new canon material, is basically what happened. It also makes sense to me that the Imperial Remnant would try their hand again at some point, as they did in the Heir to the Empire trilogy. If you look at the United States history after the Revolutionary War, it was an uncertain time, with a lot of people hobbling together some form of government that quickly gave way to something else, and even then, that union was challenged by subsequent wars, sometimes with the same combatants, international adversaries, and internal politics, with the Civil War perhaps being the most crucial crux in the nation's history in that first century post-revolution. And it's not like America isn't plenty divided to this day. Since the New Republic was unlikely to hunt down the Empire's troops to extinction and instead try to find a way to live in peace with them, and with the resurrected Emperor in hiding pulling the strings, I can buy that certain politicians kept the galaxy from ever fully reuniting, and that the New Republic's disarmament was taken further than it should have in case the Imperial Remnant violated their treaties and started rearming, much as the Germans did prior to World War II. As to the Anakin point, I never liked or bought the idea that Anakin's death would end the Sith. The Sith is a belief as much as it is a group. As long as there are Jedi and the Sith's teachings still exist, the Sith was always likely to return in some form, since it exists to oppose the Jedi. There is a Christian religious idea that states that there must be an opposition in all things to fulfill the purpose of creation under God's hand. If you believe that, and you buy into the spiritual aspects of Star Wars and that the Force consists of different sides, then there must always be evil Force users as well as good ones. This also goes back into the Buddhism ideas that Lucas let permeate through the original trilogy. The Force was kind of based off of an Eastern concept of philosophy as much as it was a Western, and Taoism, that yin and yang, are definitely a part of those teachings. Also, keep in mind that Lucas was going to bring back the Sith in his treatments and reveal Leia as the true chosen one. So it's not like he didn't go back and forth on what bringing balance back to the Force means and what Anakin's role was in all this. Speaking of religious ideas, prophecies are always finicky things anyways. For example, the prophecies of Isaiah often had multiple applications, one for Isaiah's present day with the kings of Judah, and one for the future, generally centering on the two comings of Jesus Christ. And depending on if you're religious and what religion you're a part of, Jesus did not fulfill all the prophecies the Messiah was predicted to fulfill. Since we don't know who gave the prophecy in Star Wars, and it was never explicitly given to us in the films, there is some room for interpretation, which Lucas initially seemed to support the idea of. That's not to say that Anakin's death didn't restore balance. It did for a time. And since Rey and Ben Solo are inspired in part by Anakin's actions, you could argue he still played a part in Palpatine's ultimate demise. About those original trilogy heroes not getting a happy ending, I can't really argue against that. They don't until Rey and crew finish the fight against Palpatine, and some people just don't like that they didn't live to finish the struggle, and having the sequel trilogy crew finally defeat Palpatine robs the original trio of their victory. That's a solid point, but my interpretation is a bit different. Did the fact that Germany rose again to fight the Allies 20 years later negate the sacrifice of the soldiers from World War I? Does the fact that Nazis still exist after Hitler's death mean that the World War II soldiers' lives amounted to a zero sum? Not really. It depends on how you interpret a victory. And to quote from another Disney film, a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. Our heroes did succeed in toppling a galactic empire, which despite the First Order's invasion of the galaxy after this film, they never managed to become quite the same thing. They ensured that there would be a future and reminded us that no threat was invincible, which serves as a beacon to others of hope and belief. They also helped a fallen hero redeem himself. Their victories may not have been fully permanent, but history is an ongoing story, with each episode building on top of each other. Heroes and their examples never die. Though evil will always resurface, it's important to continue the fight for freedom and be ever vigilant during our time in mortality. We've covered a lot already, so I'll keep my production praises and criticisms brief. I don't think Abrams always has the greatest sense of serving the story at the expense of his own ambitions, and I think his mystery box storytelling approach made this trilogy a lot harder than it needed to be to complete from the start. That being said, he does know how to work with actors to get more out of them than they can with their own devices, and I love his visual sensibilities as a director. This film has a lot of energy to it, and there's a good, light-hearted tone that gives way to the more somber and serious moments without ever feeling unbalanced. That's an impressive accomplishment. Though some of that praise must go to the editing and casting departments. Mary Jo Markey and Marianne Brandon are both super talented editors, and I think they were rightly nominated for their work in this film. It's just a shame Brandon couldn't replicate that same feat with The Rise of Skywalker. Despite my belief that this film has too many characters, Nina Gold has an eye for talent that has served her well in several projects. She doesn't always hit home runs, even with Star Wars films, but Episode 7 is one of the films I've seen where I personally don't think there's a real dud in the casting area. I'm a bit more mixed on John Williams' score. Williams has more talent in his left hand than most of us have in both of ours, but it's understandable that not every one of his symphonies are pure gold. There is pure gold here to my mind. Rey's theme, March of the Resistance, and the Jedi Steps have instantly become some of my favorite themes in his catalog, and I love the intelligent, slow unfolding of the Force theme throughout the film. But overall, I think the music for the sequels are the weakest John did for this series. They're still better than most of the scores that came out in those respective years, partly due to Williams' unique ability to sonically carry the stories and characters of the film while using all parts of the orchestra, and his never being afraid to let that orchestra have an omnipresence in the film. But while these scores may have indeed been worthy of their Oscars in those years, it's a shame that there are 3 other scores that I think are stronger and don't have that honor. Since I've already done enough praising of the film, shall we end with some more of the things I don't like that I haven't already mentioned? As fun as it is to see Han's troubles catch up with him, I'm not the biggest fan of the Rathtar scene. Some of it may just be the design. They look more like spaghetti monsters than anything. I get this scene is supposed to be a family-friendly kind of terrifying, but I feel no terror looking at these things. Starkiller Base is a tricky idea to me, as it is an escalation of the Death Star, bigger and more powerful without being that interesting inherently. While I fully agree that Palpatine isn't going to let a little thing like failure stop him from exploiting a good idea like blowing up planets and taking it to the max, I am curious as to how the First Order kept this kind of project under wraps, since it's a long development cycle that involves a whole planet, and as we learn later, one that has historical significance to the galaxy. I actually think it might have been a good idea for this to have been a New Republic idea that Leia was against, and the First Order took it over. I'm okay with it being a hyperspace weapon and taking out planets far away, but I do not buy people being able to see its beams from Takodana. To his credit, in the commentary for the film, Abrams has acknowledged that this is an oversight, but then he backpedals and says Star Wars is a fantasy where you can leave some things unexplained. Yes, that's true, and I defend the use of that argument with the Force to a degree, but you shouldn't use that as a crutch for everything. Particularly in this case, as Star Wars takes place in an entire galaxy and not just a solar system. I do have a solution for this. The galaxy has news stations like the HoloNet. Why not have the transmissions from Hosnian Prime just cut out, and we see footage of a later report showing the destruction of the system? I actually think this could have given more weight to the event since we don't see it. We're left to our imaginations as to how this was accomplished, and you could have it visually resemble real-world tragedies in this way. Rey's vision on Takodana is still one I'm trying to figure out, and this may be a lost cause because I don't think the filmmakers entirely knew what this was about. The Force is trying to show her important images which will inform her choice to go down the path of the light, but I'm still a little baffled about starting her in the corridors on Cloud City. Apparently, the filmmakers were going to go a step further and have her witness part of the battle between Luke and Vader. If they had done that, then I could argue was meant to set up the idea that the light and dark are ever in conflict, which informs her conflict with Kylo Ren in the later films. But without that, it comes off as just vague intrigue. Last bit to mention, Chewie passes Leia on Dakar. I'm with everyone else on this. That makes no sense. Yes, include Rey in that somber moment, but don't leave out Chewie. Once again, Abrams points this out in the commentary, but unlike the Starkiller Base thing, he fully owns up to this as a mistake and wishes he could go back to correct this. Even after 10 years, I've never not liked The Force Awakens. I keep waiting for that to happen, but it hasn't yet. I understand a lot of the problems people have with this film. I've seen a good number of the video essays detailing them, and I even agree with some of them. But when rewatching this film, I'm always pumped by the time the credits roll. Not everything that came afterwards lived up to the promise of this film, and I have some strong criticism to deliver about some of those efforts. All that being said, The Force Awakens reminds me of my love for this series and reinvigorates me. I was never not a fan of Star Wars, but my interest started to wane after the end of the prequels. Episode 7 was the spark that reignited the fire in me about this series, and even if no one else feels that way about it, I do. It remains an enjoyable experience for this fan, and one that carries a little more significance to me than most of the others. Despite the optimistic end of this film, reality must come home to roost. Darkness always retaliates, and we must be on our guard. Sometimes we will suffer losses, and it can seem like what we have achieved before was only a hollow victory. Yet, as a wise general once said, hope is like the sun. If you only believe in it when you see it, you'll never make it through the night.